Well, thanks to everyone for coming. So I'm here for only a short time, and I got a cold. So if you can't hear me, let me know, and I'll try to speak more loudly. Emil, when I told him that I was coming, he asked me straight away if I would speak to the Anthropology Club. And I asked him, what about? I said, I don't have anything prepared. I'm not planning to talk about anything. I'm planning to do a little field research. And he goes, talk about your book. So, of course, he's persuasive, so I agreed, but I had nothing prepared. And I thought I would prepare. So anyhow, I got sick, like I said, but this is an older talk that has notes, but I can't actually read the notes anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and basically give you an overview of the talk. I'll pass the book around so you can look at it. I don't expect that anyone's read it, which means I can say anything I want about it, and you'll say it's okay, and you'll have to disagree after you read it. So I guess the way to begin is really giving a sense of what the book is about and what it's not about. And I hope that you're not disappointed, because everyone comes to a talk with some purpose in mind, right? You want to get something out of it, and you think you have a sense of what it's about. And the title of itself is Practicing Islam. And I'm always afraid, like some people are going to buy the book as a how-to practice Islam. But it's not about that. And it's also, even though it's about Kyrgyzstan, most of the book really is a theoretical argument that I'm trying to make about a number of issues that I think that Kyrgyzstan is a good space to talk about that. And I'll sort of try to give an overview of some of these problems. But the idea of practicing Islam is that, like most things in life, we are always becoming, we are always practicing, we're always doing, right? So it's not that you all of a sudden get it and it's over, right? So that's sort of where we're getting at in terms of practicing, that with everything, with studies, with relationships, there are always engagements of ongoing practice. Okay, so there's a few main theoretical problems that I'm trying to get at in the book. And of all groups, I probably have to speak less about Kyrgyzstan to you all than I do in most contexts. So I won't actually do too much about that. But there's three sort of big problems that I think we struggle theoretically with in anthropology, but also in other social sciences to try to get at. So one, how do you understand movement and social change? How do you theorize movement? And how do you see knowledge? So how many people know what knowledge is? This is the participatory part of the talk here. What's that? Knowledge. When I say knowledge, what is it?
From which particular perspective?
Okay, it starts to get complicated. That's the point, right? Is that in a sense, we do know what knowledge is, but how do you study it, right? So we could say philosophy, we could say other things, but people know things. We all agree that, right? You all know things that I don't know. You are knowledgeable about things, and you value those things that you know. How do we study that? It's kind of a problem, and I think I'll get into more detail. This is largely what the book is about, is trying to sort of set up a structure, a theoretical framework for starting to see these things. Also, the idea of theorizing movement, I'll get to in a bit. But it's how we get from one point to another point, right? So you can, all of you somehow got to the university here. And you can tell a story as to how you got here. And you'll vary that story based on who you're talking to. So it may be that I worked really hard and I'm just really smart and I got here. Or it may be I was going to be a lawyer, I was going to be a physician, but I wasn't so good in the sciences or something else, and I got interested in anthropology. But you don't know, you tell people different stories, right? So this idea of movement, this idea of going from one place to another also varies a great deal. And then also variation in social change. Part of this came out of when I was first living in Kyrgyzstan in 1999 through 2001, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Naren Oblast. And I would always hear people account for the differences between the way people practiced religion and the cultural differences in Iran as opposed to in the South was because, because the Uzbeks and the Southerners got Islam before the people in the mountains, right, by a few hundred years or so, which makes absolutely no sense, right, in terms of why it explains these things, in that we all learn religion and everything else within our own lifetime, right? So there has to be more that explains the variation and the change than just to say that Islam came in the 15th century in one place and the 17th century, 18th century in another place, right? So there has to be something that's a bit more complicated than to say that when something arrived explains where the differences are. Am I okay so far? All right, this you know. If you don't, then we have a lot of problems. But these are sort of the field sites where I did most of my work. Like I said, I was in Iran and then also in the South. I don't have to spend as much time with you on that. The book is set up in a way that's a bit unsettling, I think, for many anthropological texts. Most anthropology will spend a lot of time on one or two people, and it'll go in depth. There's a collection of poems by a poet by the name of Edgar Master Lee called Spoon River Anthology. And it's within this collection of poems, it's about this fictional town called Spoon River. And within these poems, you learn a little bit about each person in the village, but not everybody, right? And so you want a bit more to, you want to know a bit more about the baker or about the butcher or the barber or whoever all these characters are, but you only are limited in sort of the bits and pieces of information that you get. I did something similar in the book on purpose. So there's about 33 interlocutors, main characters in the book. Some are you learn more about them than others. Some you still want to learn more about. You want to know what happens to them. Some have since died, but I don't talk about those types of things, right? I think that there's a tension within the book of wanting to know more about these individuals, but knowledge also being always incomplete. Right? And I think if we think about our own relationships with people, that's the way it is. There's close people who you know a lot about, you still may want to know more about, and there's those who you make assumptions about them based on the limited knowledge that you have. And you also fill in those gaps. So there's a purposeful tension there of trying to get you to sort of see that all knowledge is limited, and in such, we can only gain a bit of what we're trying to get at. All right, as I was talking about, one of the things I'm trying to get at is looking at variation and change, right? What accounts for transformations within societies? How do people become who they are? How do they become different than who they were? Right? What are the things that influence these types of things? This is of course relevant at many levels, at community development. Governments, states are interested in these things, but it's not an idle question, right? It's something that's still trying to be figured out. As I mentioned, one of the challenges is trying to theorize movement. So as I said, we talk about a narrative where we go from point A to point B, how I became who I am, how I ended up here, and that narrative is clean, it's coherent, and we share different parts of the narrative with different people at different times. But the reality is much more ambiguous. It's quite directional. Has anyone walked along a beach? Okay. Have you tried to walk on a straight line along the sand and looked back and see that it's not straight at all, right? Or maybe you change your mind and you realize you want to go somewhere else and you end up at sea and you talk about, well, I'm at sea because this is where I really always wanted to be, right? So how do you get at these things? Within social sciences, we really struggle with talking about movement and change. We're not very good at predicting. We're pretty good historically, Even there we have problems, but we're pretty good historically. And so, trying to address a framework that allows us to get a sense of moving forward and also dealing with ambiguity. Now, all of us live with a great deal of cognitive dissonance, I believe. What I mean by that is that we know there's a right or a wrong way to do something. And, if we're talking about Islam or Islamic practice, or any religious practice, or probably any moral practice, I will say that this is how it's supposed to be done, and I may discount someone who doesn't practice it that way. That I'll give myself an exception, right? I'll say, well, I'm not doing this because something happened, right? Or I'm not going to eat halal because of, I don't know, it's inconvenient right now, but it's okay for me because I know why I'm not doing it. Or someone else, if they don't do it, I judge them a bit more, right? So behind all of these things, there's a sense of judgment. There's a sense of sort of thinking about others differently than thinking about myself. And that's probably all I want to say about that. Are we okay so far? Okay. All right, so the question then is, how do we get to knowledge? And knowledge is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And I think that, like I said, I think we struggle trying to study it. Part of what I try to do is to look at ways that you can begin breaking that down. I think that knowledge has three components that are always together, but they're always but I think you can begin, once you're breaking down in these separate components, you can start to see where variations come out, right? So you have a social organization of knowledge. You have a corpus of knowledge, a body of knowledge, body of information. And you also have a medium of transmission, right? So you have the content, you have a way that the content gets put into a frame, and you have the frame itself, which is dictated by the environment in which you are in, and a number of other things, but we'll come to that in a second. Why does this matter? I think that critiquing somewhat issues within anthropology focuses a lot on culture. And we value things differently when we talk about culture. Right? We also relativize when we talk about culture. Right? So I don't do it this way, but you do, and it's your culture, and that's okay, even if I find it offensive. But I don't believe that. I think that there are some things that are offensive or wrong. Right? So I'm not a culture relativist. I do recognize there's difference in cultures, but I also think that we value culture differently than we value knowledge. Right? I think we value knowledge more than we value culture. And if we start to see the things that people do as knowledge, we might value that more than if we start just to see it as culture. Right? So that's one of the also arguments underlying this, is that if we look at the things that we normally would talk about as culture as knowledge, we might start to see it differently. Now there's limits, of course, to this, right? Because there are things that we know that we cannot articulate very well. Right? How many people know Beethoven? Can anyone describe Beethoven without humming? Deaf. Okay, but there's a lot of people who are deaf who are Beethoven, right? Or I can say that I recognize someone's face, and I can describe the face, but I'm not very eloquent. So I know the face, but I can't describe it very well for you to be able to pick out who that person is, right? There's limits of the way in which we can describe knowledge, but those are still things that we hold to as knowing, right? So I think that there are things outside of culture, beyond culture, that we know, that we claim we know, that make us who we are and impact how we see the world, but it's not all culture. I also think knowledge matters a lot because I think there's a trajectory from what it is that we know to what it is that we think is right and wrong. Right? So from knowing to the moral world to how we feel about it, right? To the affective world. Right? So I think that these are productive ways of starting to look at what might be something as knowledge. All right. Am I okay so far? So when I talk about social organization, the basic frame, and I outline this separately in the various chapters, but if you look at how you could break down a social organization of knowledge, this is just one way of doing it. But if you look at sort of state restrictions and potentials of an environment in which one lives, the social restrictions and potentials, what one can do, what one can't do within that environment, the economic restrictions, right? And you can go further into those things, whether it's an open or closed political system, whether there's a religious environment, or whether there's social conventions that allow one or prohibit one to do certain acts, wealth, poverty. There's a number of things that structure our social relations that we often don't think about, but as anthropologists we're familiar with, right? This allows us to start to see the way in which knowledge starts to get organized, and we can see how different influences in one place or another start to influence how other people engage with some of these questions, right? So if one person is in a pretty restrictive state environment, they're going to see politics differently than if it's an open environment. You're going to start to think about the way in which you can speak or protest or support or find partners or whatever differently, right? Those differences matter, and they can be long-lasting. What constitutes the corpus, roughly, right? So when I talk about a corpus of knowledge, how can I start to look at that? Part of that is starting to look at just sort of, the environment in which knowledge gets put forward. So you have a historical and a social frame, which this could be either where one lives, an environment where they live, sort of mountains and valleys, right? This was, most of what I was doing was between Naren Oblast and Osha Oblast, the mountains and the valleys. Whether it's a village or a city, whether it's pre-Soviet, post-Soviet, Soviet, post-Soviet, whatever we call these things, what one's profession is, the work that one learns how to do influences what they know. I grew up in a small farm town where the neighbor across the street was a farmer, and he didn't have more than an 8th grade education, right? He left school when he was like 14. And he would say, like, if you don't know when to plant corn or beans, you don't know how to feed yourself, so you're not very smart, right? So for him, knowledge was framed about the ability to be able to feed yourself. I'm around a lot of people in an environment, in an academic environment, who don't know how to grow anything, right? They're all in their heads, right? They write books, so they think they're smart, but they can't feed themselves, right? So there's a different framing based on where you grew up and what you do that embodies how you think about knowledge and what you know, how you value it. The same way with education, right? So it's not just about going to school, it's about where you go to school, what you study, how much you study, whether you care about it or not, what you're trying to get out of it. And of course, religious frame. I mean, all of these are just examples, but I think these start to play out in real life, right? So whether or not there's a general revival around religion, whether there's no interest at all in religion, whether there's an opposition to religion, whether there's sort of local tradition being put forward, or sort of some external authority, right? That what matters is not sort of who's speaking to me here, but someone else. I'll give you an example. I was talking with a colleague, or a friend, a number of years ago, and we were talking about drinking. He considers himself a pious Muslim, and we were talking about drinking kummus. And I asked him, I said, how do you reconcile this alcoholic? I wasn't being judgmental about it at all. But he never thought about it as having alcohol in it, right? His response was to be more restrictive, right? Why he should listen to, a PhD from the West about this made no sense to me, right? But he felt that this was more restrictive, so he would stop drinking it. Whereas there are local traditions and good Islamic scholars who can justify him drinking this, right? So where do people go for locations of authority? I would say I was not the authority on that, especially since I was asking a question and not passing judgment. But he interpreted it differently, and I don't know. I mean, you begin to see how these things start to influence people's body of knowledge and how they engage with it. Moving to the medium of transmission. So there are very different ways and affective ways of how we communicate. So we're probably pretty good with sort of the discursive parts of things, right? We largely talk to each other. We listen to each other sometimes. We write, we read, and we sort of often value those most as sort of sources of knowledge. But of course, we all know that gestures, rituals, they can convey different meanings. They can negate meanings, right? So I can say, I don't know, like Emil's got nice hair, and I can, throw my eyes differently, and it can mean that I'm being sarcastic or cynical, but you have to be in the context to see that. We all know these types of engagements with our close friends, with strangers, where the words that they can say, the gestures that go along with those things can impact the meaning. Now, what's the difference in some of these things? One different, do you have a question? Or stretching, okay. One difference is that between sort of written and spoken, for example, is if you have the same story, and if it's conveyed in an oral form, transmitted orally, you might have a number of variations of that story, but a general core of the story that's more or less true. It tends to be the case that cultures or communities will allow more ambiguity in those stories, right, than they do in when the transmission of the knowledge is largely textual. Part of that is because a text takes the authority outside of the individual and it puts it somewhere else, right? So it's no longer something that you and I are disagreeing about. It's placed somewhere else. It's in a text. It's not variable. You tend to have in textual environments, in textual situations, there tends to be less openness for ambiguity, less flexibility for ambiguity. Right? So, part of what I'm arguing in the book is that as you start to look at these different aspects of knowledge, you see variations in how it effectively impacts a community. So I'll just give an example of how some of this comes together, right? So if you imagine, and this is sort of going further within the medium of transmission, but if you imagine sort of two types of observation, communication, they're both experiential, right? You both are part of these engagements, so this acceptance of the knowledge. But there's direct, participatory, and there's also indirect, observed, right? So you can be in the environment, watching it. It can be, active or passive. A father can teach a son how to pray. A son can mimic a father praying in sort of a passive environment, not necessarily knowing why. It can also be indirect, observing purely. A son watching a father pray but not mimicking, or a son noticing the father pray indirectly. All of these sort of lead to different aspects of engagement and eventually different ways of making sense of how to act afterwards at different points in life. It gets slightly more complicated. I won't bore you with the slide, but this is sort of, as I develop the theory in the book, this is sort of where it moves towards. Now, one of the questions when I was talking about the about theorizing movement. Part of it is that question of what I refer to as social navigation, how we move from one point to another. How we get from point A to point B is something that we are always encountering, and we're always encountering it with the knowledge that's around us, right? Knowledge which is incomplete, knowledge which we're making sense of and utilizing in different ways all the time. It is, I think, in essence, the process of becoming who we are. It's a navigation in response or in relationship to the environment that's always changing, and it's sort of directional. It's not always in the direction we hope it to be, but you can start to see, I think, based on some of the other things, assumptions in certain directions that might be more likely to end up in other directions. In some ways, I think this is, I suggest that this is a way of starting to theorize movement, right? How we navigate in the world. To sort of move from sort of just the historical and the present to more contemporary selves. One example of that, of course, is education, right? Education is about social engineering. We try to make people different from who they were before. When you call it social engineering, it's not very well received often. But we do this all the time, right? We try to change and influence people. But there's that individual navigation that takes place in relationship to the groups that we're part of, the political environments in which we sit, and our friends and families and such that are always at play. Variations aren't just regional, of course, right? So I never make the claim, nor would anyone in this room, that Central Asia is an isolated place. Now, no place in which people live is isolated. It's always the center of people's worlds. Right? Now, there is a sort of a global view of things that certain places are less significant than others. I don't believe that's the case for any individual or any community. Right? It's just that all have different perspectives, all have different ways of knowing and making sense of the environment in which they're living. Right? And it's far better to make sense of that and keep that in mind than to be overly concerned with how, one country or another country, one group of people or another group of people think about a particular place. Okay. Like I said, this came sort of at a different talk that I gave at George Washington University, where there was, of course, a concern about security. But I think in some ways it's also relevant here. When we think about security, I suspect it conjures different ideas for different people. For me, it's largely about well-being. What does it mean to live a safe and secure life? And that means something very different in a village, in my home community, at a national level. But ultimately, I think that if we start to see security as the provision of well-being, it may also frame how we engage with discourse around security and what it means to be safe, what it means to be protected and provided for both in a community and by a state. Part of the reason why I think that's important is because I believe we're all biased. There's no way out of a bias. Even as we attempt to try to look and value someone else's framework for knowing things, we still meet in the limits of our own knowing. And this, of course, is part of what I was talking about in terms of the whole book around Muslimness. How does one become a Muslim? How does one practice? How does one engage? Okay, so that was a quick overview of the book, which again I suspect was probably a little more theory than what you may have expected when the title of the book is Practicing Islam. But I'm happy to entertain substantive questions about Islam itself, but I felt it was probably more useful at least to begin giving a framework of what the book is actually about, which is trying to use Kyrgyzstan or the field work that I did here as a generative case of looking at knowledge and how people come to be who they are. Okay. So I'll just open it up for questions now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I know we didn't plan, but much appreciated.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
So my question is about kind of some of the binaries that you postulated.
Sure.
Which are between, when you talk about social organizations, you have 3 binary sets there. And one of the middle one is of most interest, and so it's kind of a multi-part question. The other 2 are directly open, closed, wealthy, poor, right? Yet religious and social conventions are not necessarily as binaristic, or as clearly. So could you kind of work to talk through that in the same way that when you give the example of the father teaching the son, he is active, but when the son mimics, he is passive. So you talk about generative education, which is true. Why is the teacher active, but students or the learner is passive in this system? Because what we know, because that's what the postulation is put up there, suggests at least.
That's not what I mean, no.
Well,
okay, but no, I mean you're right. I mean all language is incomplete, and so no, I mean the way I think of it. I mean I'll just get to the medium stuff first. I mean this son is being engaged in an interactive way with the father, and the father's. So it's I'm not trying to emphasize the teacher, but I'm trying to emphasize that relationship of a father to a son where they're talking through things and he's showing things how to do. So that's what I meant about the active part. I wasn't trying to emphasize the father so much as the engagement that the son was having.
Because in the slide it says that the son is passive in his mimic, right? So I'm not sure I understand. So maybe I'm kind of
sure. No, that's okay. So
how is that passive?
I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think about things that my dad taught me. And then I think about things that I tried to do as my dad was doing them. Right? So it might be praying, it might be trying to dig a hole. And it wasn't that I was participating at the same time, but it wasn't that there was sort of a direct engagement with my father, he wasn't trying to teach me. I wasn't learning. I was learning things as I was going. Now one could also say, one could say the passive stuff is probably not the right way to frame it. I was just trying to make a distinction between sort of, the teacher, being directly taught and being, engaging. Both I think are sort of participatory, but that's sort of what I was trying to get at, but it may not be the right terms.
The idea is rather initiation rather than like the initiation has been.
It could be. It could be. I think the main distinction I'm trying to get at is that there's variations, and these are only a few examples. They're not the only ones, but there's variations in how I engage and how I invest in any of these things. Right? There's a difference between whether I'm active or more passive, and whether I'm participating or simply observing. Whether or not you're watching a ritual, whether you're participating in a ritual, all of these things. Again, active, passive, this may not be the best language, but that's sort of what I'm trying to get at and trying to make the distinction between those two. In terms of the open closeness, none of that, in the book there's much more detail and sort of and a lot more messiness than there is here.
Well, I meant the middle one. So the other two are more clear, and I understand they're messy, right? The top and bottom make sense to me, although obviously they're muddled, right? Real situations do well in the top here.
Yeah.
But it's the middle bracket of binaries, religious environments and social conventions.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure I understand how those become a binary in the same systemized way as the other two sets.
So part of it has to do with, I talk about it more, but I think it's the limits of trying to make something more simple. And I actually give more than 2 examples for that. But there are there's 2 extremes, but there's really not 2 extremes. There's multiple variations between both extremes. And so part of what I try to go at is within each of those, within a religious environment, there's a more conservative, there's a more liberal, there's various gradations in between, all of which are part of influencing how someone understands their social restrictions or their social potentials. Likewise with social conventions, whether or not you have a more liberal, more conservative home environment, neighborhood environment, friend set, all of those things influence that. Even within wealth and poverty, there's variations. Same way with open and closed political systems. All of these things are relatively incomplete. But I'm trying to sort of give a general ballpark of where we start to put people. One of the reasons why there's so many interlocutors in the book is because there are people who are all over the place. And I try to sort of make suggestions as to what led them in certain trajectories as opposed to other trajectories based on what they talk about. But it's not perfect. But none of life is. That's my argument.
There's a question here.
Yeah.
It's basically about whether you've been observing the society in Kyrgyzstan becoming more religious and how that all relates to the questions of radicalization.
So Emil's heard me talk about this a number of times.
It's not my question.
No, I know, but you're going to hear me say something you've heard me say before. So I've done a lot of work on criticizing sort of the relationship between Islam and secularism and security. Oftentimes there's an assumption that the more religious someone becomes, the more dangerous the environment might be. At least that's sort of the securitization thesis. I disagree with that. I think that being religious, living a religious life, is a radical way to live. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Right? Now, whether or not people are becoming more religious or not, I would say they're changing in how they practice religion. And I try to sort of suggest some of the reasons why, some of the reasons that push some of those changes in particular directions. But I don't value the way one person practices religion differently than the way someone else practices. There are plenty of people who will say, here who will say there's only one way to be a Muslim. Usually that way is someone like me. I mean, not me himself, but someone like whoever says that, right? I become the way, and this is part of what I was talking about in terms of cognitive dissonance before. You make exceptions for yourself that you don't necessarily grant to others. Now, I have been, I've been in Bishkek, where during Ramadan, I've been with people at the mosque praying, and I've been with people who were toasting to Muhammad over vodka. These are problematic things, right? These are two very different ends. Now, you can identify yourself as somewhere there or whatever. You can say, this is a good Muslim, this is not a good Muslim. But there's a change, there's a transition in how people engage with it. So in terms of the question whether or not people are becoming more or less religious, I don't know. I think that people are changing in their religiosity. It appears that way over a number of years. I don't see that as a bad thing. But I also think that what's changing is not necessarily the veracity of it, but the frame of it, the context of it, the way in which it gets expressed. Because some people would still say that they practice religion slightly differently than others. Yeah.
You mentioned that security is seen differently by different people in different communities. I'm just curious about your research in Kyrgyzstan specifically. How have you seen communities within the country see security differently, and has that affected how the communities are specifically structured in their own small ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so the, yeah, no, I think that one of the interesting tensions, I think, is what the role of Islam is supposed to be in the state. And this is also with religion in general, right? Western secular state has a different view of where religion belongs, right? Since the French Revolution, where Clermont de Tonneray says everything to the Jew as an individual but nothing to the Jew as a nation, you have religious identity being secondary to the individual identity or to the national identity. Right? And that's pretty much how nation states have gone forward in much of the world. I think in Kyrgyzstan and the former Soviet states, you've had people who have gone into positions of power who largely came out of a Soviet structure for whom religion was not a lived category. Right? So for them, Islamic practice, religious practice, was something that was cultural. It was best if it was cultural, but it shouldn't interfere too much with the polity, with the state. I think, I mean, I've been critical of international crisis groups reporting on Central Asia, in part because there's an assumption that if there's a plural democracy, economic security, and other good things, people won't become more religious. I don't actually think those things are related. People may become more religious, and that may be independent of economics, politics, and such. The reason I'm sort of talking about that is I think that the position of people who talk about security come from a position where where for them religion is not a lived category. And so they see it differently, and so maybe they get a little worried about these things. So some countries struggle with Tablighi Jamaat. I don't think Tablighi Jamaat is a problem at a religious level. What's threatening to the state is that it's able to mobilize a community in ways that have never been mobilized before, right? Because people have different relations, they have different social networks, as we were talking about here. But that can be very threatening to a state who's questionable about religion. And I think that also, in talking about security and secularization and such, a lot of Western analysts see that as problematic, in part because for them religion is something that should be contained. It should be sort of not too engaged with the state. Yeah.
Thank you. Since you talk about more about systems like knowledge issues, I would like to ask also about another thing. As a young anthropologist, I believe to approach cultural relativism. And do you think that researchers should stay biased when study something? I mean, from my background, from my perspective, should I theorize, conceptualize everything what I found?
Yeah.
Because for me, conceptualizing is itself, it's hell for me. I hate this process, but I have to do it for my research and for my studies. So I do believe that I have to apply this approach. I have to do it because of the anthropological background, but you as a professor, you said that there could be something wrong with culture itself. Can you give any examples?
Yeah. So I think that certainly there's people who disagree. Right? I do have colleagues, anthropologists, who will let anything happen, right? Because they see their place as being only to observe. I can't do that. So when I was living in Naren, there was I had an apartment, and next to the apartment, there was a couple, and they had 2 kids, and I was friends with the kids. I mean, they were 4 and 8, right? So they were patient with me. They would work with me as I was working through language. And one night, the husband started beating his wife. Now I can say culturally, that's an okay thing, right? I can justify that, right? Because people will say, well, he's her property and all of this stuff. I can understand that language. And I can understand the environment in which that gets justified. I, however, can't live with that, right? So I do have some colleagues who would say that's okay. They just go back to sleep and they don't do anything. I went next door and asked for sugar. And 20 minutes later, I asked for more sugar, right? Until he stopped, right? And they got embarrassed, right? But I found a way to sort of try to change the situation. But I changed the situation, you know, in terms of that incident.
So you would describe this cultural thing that he leads his life?
Some people will, right? Some people will describe that as culture, right? That in this cultural environment, it's okay. It's good if you're appalled, right? But look, we all have biases. Within anthropology, we work really hard to try to overcome those. But we can't. There's absolutely no way to do it. I just don't believe we can. We try, and we have to try. But I don't think we can, I think we fail. It's important to recognize our limits, where we fall short, and we live with that. All I'm saying is that there are instances where I have gotten involved where other anthropologists would not. I've gotten involved to change a situation. Not everyone thinks that's an okay thing, because they use cultural relativism to justify the behavior. Yes. Hey, how you doing?
Thank you very much for your introduction. As you said, it really is very heavily theoretical sort of introduction.
I told Emil, but
Yeah, so it looks complicated, but definitely worth trying to understand in the book itself. We used the word becoming in a couple of
Yeah.
slides as well as in your speech, and that word, I like it because it has many meanings.
Yeah.
And my question comes from this story just I heard yesterday, last night, and it just reflects very much on what you just said. On Islam, there was a toy, not a wedding, but
Yeah.
it's a family celebration somewhere in Batken. The father and the husband and wife had 2 years ago, they went to Hajj, so they're good Muslims.
Yeah.
The children who were organizing the toy, they invited for the music, toy is basically family celebration, right? So invited musicians, the traditional Central Asian stuff, nothing rap or anything like that. But there was a more senior Muslim, very observant man. He said, either you have me in this toy, or you get and get rid of the music, or you have the music and I go. So they had to give up the music after paying 10,000 sols for it. And this man who became a good Muslim used to, about 10 years ago, he used to be a drunkard, very well-behaved man. Now he's a super religious man. And in this process, the word becoming comes to mind, and as a way of knowing, as a way of getting to know how to be a good Muslim. Right? So, in what ways do you mean, or do you also attach these nuanced meanings of the word becoming? That is,
absolutely.
it's for this old man, it's becoming to behave in a way that fits a good Muslim and not just allow anything that goes because he's been taught in a certain way. I don't know what he belongs to or in what school.
And he may not entirely know either.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the parents of the hosts, they were fine with the music. They went to Hajj. They're good. They're also becoming in a certain way. They became good, respectable Muslims. They didn't have any drinking problems before, and they didn't so dramatically change after the Hajj. And the children who agreed to get rid of the music because it's becoming to respect your elder relatives, because that's supposed to be more valuable than your music. And so in this way, I mean, many buttons in your diagrams keep jumping as to what's the social organization of knowledge here, who passes knowledge to whom in what ways, or the broken mediums of communication and knowledge is through basic imposition. And then Kyrgyzstan, people seem to be somewhat at a loss. Where did this come from? Lots of people were surprised by this little family quarrel before everything got settled. Where did we learn Islam? How did we become like this? Within 1 year or 2 years, we behave in a totally different way. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. No,
Many ways to ask this question.
no, but I think I mean that's largely the type of questions that I try to get at in the book. In terms of becoming, I mean how we become who we are, right? So not just that it's appropriate, but you know, how is it that we know what it is that we know? How do we become who we are? And there are periods where, you know, for this gentleman, that changes everything, right? And he may or may not be there in 10 years from now, right? I have a friend who, in the United States, was a Puerto Rican drug dealer. He was Catholic, but he never wasn't religious at all. And he's become really, really well known now. He's a hip hop artist, Muslim hip hop artist. But he became very Islamic, and for him it was as restrictive as possible was the best. And eventually that's not where he landed, right? He became a Sufi. He still does like Islamic hip hop, does concerts, tries to get people out of the gangs and off the streets. So I would say that all of those people, you know, the kids, the parents, the grandfather, they're all in different points, and we always are. We all are. So we're always in this process of becoming someone different. But you can start to see where some of these things play out and how they get.
Can I give my...
Of course. No worries.
Sorry.
No worries. You know, so how can we start to make sense? Oh, of course. To make sense of some of those things, and you know, it may be. I was in Souk for a wedding, and it was to be an Islamic wedding until I showed up with Madeline Reeves, who I think people know. So, you know, the police followed us. It happens. And then shortly thereafter, the vodka came out. And we talked with, we went back and we talked with the host and everything, and we apologized because, of course, that was not our intention. And he, you know, they wanted it to be an Islamic wedding without alcohol. But they had the alcohol there because it was easier for them when the police showed up for there to be alcohol. So there was no assumption that anyone there is a radical Muslim, whatever that might be. Right? So people make negotiations on the spot. And it's not always that one weighs out over the other. There were older people who were mad. There were younger people who were happy. There were older people who were happy. So I think that's what I'm talking about in terms of it may be at another time. They won't have that. You know, they won't be put in that type of situation. Yeah.
Well, I find your idea of social navigation very interesting. Thank you for that. And in this regard, I have, I guess, 2 questions.
Okay.
So the first one is about whether the book also addresses kind of a follow-up of how one becomes a Muslim, how one practices Islam, how one becomes engaged in Islam practices and communities. And the fourth one, with what effect on the individual and community level. And in this regard, it seems to me that we're talking about man, and that the subject of this is a man, and all the examples that we're bringing here are all about man. Does this mean that the subject of the theory and conceptualization is a man?
No.
And then if not, then how does this all relate to the experiences of becoming and practicing of Islam by women?
Yeah. So the intention is not at all to be gendered. I don't think theoretically there's that much of a difference in terms of how we know things. Now, the experiences we have are very different, right? Some of you may know Thomas Luckman, and Peter Berger wrote The Social Construction of Reality. So Luckman always felt that women were smarter than men because they could do everything that men could do. So they could experience everything, they could know everything, but men could never have the experience of giving birth. Right? So that there was an experience that no man would ever be able to have access to knowing what it really was. Right? So I do think actually most of what we know and what we do comes through experience. So this is influenced a lot by Deweyan pragmatism, for those who are familiar with philosophy, right? Sort of American pragmatism. But there are women I do talk about women in the book. A lot of times it was easier for me to talk with men, but but that doesn't mean that women are absent. And again, I think the theoretical argument doesn't change, right? Women will meet in different environments. They will talk differently, and they do talk differently when I'm around, as opposed to when it's just women around. And when there's, in some ways, a foreign anthropologist is referred to as a third sex, because men will tell you things that they wouldn't necessarily tell other men. Women will tell you things that they wouldn't necessarily tell men, and so you're somewhere in between because you're not local, you're not, So I wouldn't say in any way that it's not intentionally gendered. In terms of what it's like, then what this means about practicing or becoming Muslim. So part of it actually is really a little misleading, like the title was, right? After I did field work here, I went and I lived in Albania for a while because there's still Muslims there, but it's more religiously diverse, and it was the only officially atheist state in the world. In part because I think the process is not just about religion. I think it's about everything that we do, right? How we learn culture, how we learn what it is that we know. Religion is something that interests me because I think it's the least negotiable form of social order, right? We can distill things down in different ways, and we can try to find what we all share. But when we talk about religion, there are things that we cannot share, right? So what I mean by that is, right, Jesus is either a prophet, a heretic, or the Son of God. You can't reduce those things down to something else, right? So there are boundaries within at least 3 communities that share a same lineage, to an extent, that can't be reduced, right? So that's why I think religion is sociologically interesting. In terms of what it means to practice as a Muslim or practice as a religious person, more so or less so, again, I'm someone who is supportive of people who see religion as a lived part of their lives. But I also don't feel, again, recognizing my biases, right? I actually think there's a proper way of doing it. So I have to keep that in the back of my mind and not say that, well, you're doing it the wrong way. This is how you're supposed to pray. But I recognize that other people who are as smart or smarter than me are doing it a different way. So that's part of the tension that you hold, but I think you can still describe it. So I don't try to value whether or not it's a good thing that a society becomes more or less religious. I do push back, however, when I see a population pushing back against religion because they're uncomfortable with it, which is part of the stuff I've been doing with security and the state. Does that help?
I was just interested in Emil's vignette, right, from
Yeah.
the Vatican celebration.
So which of the 3 are doing it the right way?
No, it's like this, the part of the new identity, part of the becoming, like philosophical kind of becoming, actually disrupted the kind of cultural and social order, and he
Right.
was able to negotiate it with success, right?
Mhm.
I mean, what's the word? The party was over, right, with the music. So that's
But-
kind of an impact on the community level.
It is, and that happens not just with religion though, right? You often see a trajectory with age. Young kids do some things different than parents, than grandparents. My father, before he passed away, was concerned with very different things when he was the age of, this person's children. So we can talk about it in terms of religion, and that is part of what's at stake, but it's not the only thing at stake. And my guess is that in similar environments and other environments, they'll play off of each other and have a better sense of what they can do. There won't be that same misunderstanding. So, what's that? Yeah.
So what were the biggest obstacles that you faced while conducting field work around Kyrgyzstan?
I don't know, I felt pretty fortunate. I think that people are kind and patient and generous. It helped that I had lived here as a Peace Corps volunteer before, so it made things much easier. I had connections, I had networks that could help facilitate connections. But I don't know, I think part of being an anthropologist is you're in a space for a long period of time and you work to get people's trust. And so I think I was pretty fortunate, I feel. I was. What's that? I did. I feel like I've forgotten a lot. And usually what would happen would be I would speak Kyrgyz, they would speak Russian. Or then if I went to an Uzbek village, I'd try to speak Kyrgyz, and in Uzbek they'd try to speak, or vice versa. So there's times where I get everything mixed up and there's certain words that I don't know in a different language. So like the first time I was in Moscow, Izvinite, вы знаете, kancha sat boldu? And I was insistent that I was right. And I couldn't understand why she couldn't tell me what time it was. So. Anything else? Yeah.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation and interesting research work. I want to ask a question about the theoretical framework. It seems to me that it is a theory of practice, right? In the sense of social practice, not specifically religious practice. And as you said at the beginning,
Social practice.
social practice.
Yeah.
And as you said in the beginning, it's tuned to capturing the movement and change literally, right? I think it makes perfect sense to think about change in the context of post-Soviet countries, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, things are changing, people are changing. But I also think about your framework in relation to other theories of practice. And the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is Pierre Bourdieu and his theory of practice. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you position your own theory in relation to other theories of practice? For example, the theory of Bourdieu. What strikes me is the difference, because your concept of social navigation and, as you said, directed arbitrariness, right? I don't remember, but
Directed navigation, I think.
or directed, yeah. But it reminded me of Bourdieu's.
It's directional. I might have said it somewhere else, but anyhow, it doesn't matter.
So what strikes me is the difference because Bourdieu is in, as I read him, in how to understand movement in reproduction. But your theory is about movement in change. So how do you see the differences and just how do you position it?
Sure. So theoretically, I'm a bit of a heretic. I said theoretically, I'm a bit of a heretic, right? I think theory is useful to the extent it helps you do something or make sense of something. We often get seduced by theory and we sort of feel ourselves bound by a particular theory. What I tried to do, I do like Bourdieu, and I use Bourdieu. Largely, I was influenced by Frederick Barth, who was a mentor, and was a big encouragement for me doing this. It builds on a framework from some of his early work that's sort of there, but takes it in a slightly different approach. I probably have much more, like I said, Deweyan pragmatism in it than certainly Bourdieu. And then I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Jackson, the epistemological anthropologist.
I haven't read him, but...
Okay. So he's on your reading list. Epistemological anthropology. And so... Yeah, right. But he also does epistemological anthropology. There's a great introduction to, it's 50 pages in an edited volume he did that overviews it. But, so anyhow, I mean, it's kind of a mixture of a lot of those types of things that I'm trying to draw upon. Yeah, Emil. Yeah.
Okay, so Kyrgyzstan has just been breaking out after elections, right? And finally getting to census with what happened, right? And with what is waiting for us in the future. And we had two very different candidates, and one which is supposed to be very liberal, reformist, and the other one kind of conservative, traditional, but also known to be quite religious. We think this aspect or this component of his candidacy played any significant role in what we got after the elections, and how that is going to affect the future. And also, sort of, if you could frame it in the presidency of Montgomery, how do you? And it's been a 6-year period, right? Very controversial, very different. Particularly, so how do you position the religious framework, right, of the period, and sort of how do you evaluate what we had in 6 years, and do you think, like, what is going to happen with the gender?
I mean, what will happen, you probably know better than me, but in terms of how I would sort of, frame it up there, I mean, it would be largely around sort of the social restrictions or openness. So when we were talking about the security issues, if there's someone who is religious, who sees that as central to how they understand the world, they're more likely to support that. They're more likely to be open to having that as part of public discourse. And there may be fewer restrictions. They may not see, rising orthopraxy as threatening. So I think that that's where you can start to see some of the changes, which of course can have societal changes, that people feeling more comfortable. I don't think, and again, Emil's heard me say some of this before, I don't think people begin with ideology. I think we very rarely start with anything with ideology, but we end up doing things. So we go to the mosque because everyone's going to the mosque, or it's easier to go to the mosque, it's easier to start to do these things. And then afterwards we explain it backwards, right? Because this coincides with how I see the world, right? I think that's with a lot of things, right? Again, it's not a straight trajectory. It's sort of movement all the way around. So as things become, open for other possibilities, I think that you could start to see changes.
And if you sort of think of all these different trajectories, not as of individuals within the country, but of different countries within Central Asia, do you expect to see a further variation and or kind of a more residual
I think it varies. I mean, I think there's
even more conscious in what we have now? Or
could be. I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously, but I mean, I think that how that will impact someone, the types of relations that are opened up by a new president who is more open to religion as part of the state space could influence the relationships with different countries. But there may be other things that also weigh in. There could be economic factors. There could be strategic relations that have to be managed otherwise that sort of play a factor and limit what would other people would like to do. And then how that impacts someone in a village, remote village, may be also entirely different. Not a satisfactory answer, I know, but ask me in 6 years. Okay. Yeah.
Just a question.
Sure.
So, we have studied, the role of Islam in peace.
What's that? I'm sorry.
The role of Islam in conflict prevention and peace-building processes in Kyrgyzstan. Can you please tell a little bit about it? If you have studied it.
I only caught part of it. So,
So, if you have studied the role of Islam in peace-building processes in
Oh,
Kyrgyzstan,
okay.
or in conflict prevention processes,
Sure.
can you please tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah.
In general framework.
So the work that Emil mentioned with communities engaging with difference in religion that I do started in 2003, and it's a group of a small group of academics that have been trying to engage what it means to build community around things that are not shared, so not shared beliefs and such. The reason I'm sort of going a roundabout way, because I actually have a different idea on how one builds communities and one builds peace in an environment than sort of a mono-religious approach. Part of what we try to do is recognize that there are limits in what we can share, right? And a lot of times in our social space, we try to sort of bracket out those differences between people. So if there's something that you do and I don't want to do it, we might meet later so that I don't have to be inconvenienced by you. But of course, what it means to live in community, not as individuals, but as members of a community, is that you are restricted in that community, right? It's not free will. Right? There's certain things you can do to stay part of that community that you have to do. There's certain things that you can't do. So part of what we try to do in our work is try to build communities that recognize the discomfort in the difference, but still see that you can build a community despite that. I could go on for hours about that, but both Elena and Emil can sort of point you to some directions if you're interested in some more, because I suspect some people are getting tired.
Okay, so I don't know about you guys. I personally feel that the session was not the easiest one in the anthropologic part, but definitely very useful. As when it usually comes to all these religious conferences and round tables, we are all experts on what is happening, right? But there is very little theoretical platform, there is very little theory behind what we do. Right? And so in that sense, yeah, what David has offered is really good, right? And so we are going to order a book for the AUCA library, a couple of copies at least, yeah. And so hopefully in a couple of months you will have a chance to read. And as a sort of forgot it completely. Yeah, let's thank